In April of 2024, a group of birdwatchers got lost in a forest in Indiana. What they found made them immediately call the police. A car. Blue. Devoured by 73 years of vegetation. Trees growing through the engine. Moss covering every inch of rusted metal. When they removed the rust from the license plate, they found a number. JXC 847. Illinois. And when they typed that number into the system, a red flag appeared instantly. Associated with unsolved, disappearance. July 1951. Chicago PD. The car had been there for more than 7 decades. But where was the driver? That question is about to be answered in a way no one expected. And the answer will reveal not just a murder, but an execution so calculated, so meticulously planned, that it managed to remain secret for 3/4 of a century. This is the story of Thomas Edward Callahan, and of the day he simply disappeared. If you like cases that defy time, that remain unanswered for decades, then you need to hear this story to the end. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because your support keeps this work alive. Chicago, 1951. The city still breathed the golden age of organized crime. Only 22 years since the fall of Al Capone, but his shadows still danced in the streets. The loop teemed with legitimate and illegitimate businesses, so firmly intertwined that it was impossible to separate them. Unions controlled the docks, politicians lined their pockets, and men like Thomas Edward Callahan navigated these murky waters with calculated skill. Thomas was 34 years old that summer of 1951. Anyone who saw him for the first time immediately noticed his presence. 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, hands that seemed to have been sculpted to hold things firmly. Brown hair always impeccably combed back with brilliantine in the style of the era. Gray-blue eyes that never blinked first in a conversation. A thin scar crossed his left eyebrow, a reminder of a fight no one dared ask about. But Thomas was not just muscle and intimidation. Those who knew him well knew another side. He wore well-cut suits, always with a pocket square matching his tie. He preferred Kentucky bourbon to Canadian whiskey. He read the Chicago Tribune religiously every morning at the same diner in Bridgeport, Rosie's Corner, always sitting with his back to the wall, always facing the door. That was the first rule he learned. On the streets of the South Side, never be vulnerable. Thomas was born in 1917 in Bridgeport, heart of the Irish South Side of Chicago. Son of an Irish stevedore and a housewife of Polish descent, he grew up in a world where loyalty was worth more than money and reputation was the currency of survival. His father died when he was 12 years old, crushed by a load at the docks. His mother, Catherine, never fully recovered, but worked until her fingers bled to keep Thomas and his 2 younger sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, fed. At 15 years old, Thomas was already working at the Maxwell Street markets. At 18, he already had his first side business, controlling illegal betting on clandestine boxing matches. At 21, he was known in all the bars between Bridgeport and back of the yards. Not as a common thug, but as someone with brains. Thomas understood that violence without strategy was wasteful. He built his reputation by being efficient, silent, and absolutely reliable with those who were loyal to him. During the war, while other men his age fought in the Pacific or Europe, Thomas remained in Chicago because of a heart murmur that disqualified him from military service. This could have been shameful, but Thomas turned it into opportunity. With so many men away, he expanded his businesses. Black market rationing, falsified documents for draft dodgers, protection for merchants. He did not become rich, but built a solid network of contacts and owed favors. In 1948, Thomas married Rose Moretti, a 23-year-old Italian woman with dark hair and a matching temperament. Rose knew exactly who Thomas was. Her brother, Vincent, worked for him. But she also saw the man who came home and put fresh flowers on the table every Friday. The man who never raised his voice to her, even when they argued. The man who dreamed, on quiet nights, of eventually leaving that world and opening his own bar, something legitimate, something to leave to the children they planned to have. They lived in a two-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport above an Italian bakery. The smell of fresh bread rose every morning. Rose worked as a secretary in a law office during the day. Thomas never specified exactly what he did, but money appeared regularly. They were not rich, but lived comfortably by post-war standards. Thomas's routine was as precise as a Swiss watch. He woke at 7 in the morning, coffee with Rose. Walked to Rosie's. Corner at 8. Newspaper and black coffee until 9. Then his rounds began, visiting his businesses, collecting protection payments, resolving disputes. Lunch was always at the same place, the Shamrock Tavern, usually a corned beef sandwich and a Schlitz beer. Afternoons were for meetings, always in different places, never establishing predictable patterns. But at 6:30 in the evening, without fail, Thomas called Rose from a payphone. Always. And then there was the blue Morris Oxford. Thomas bought the used car in March of 1951 from a dealer in Hammond, Indiana, paying in cash. It was a 1949 Morris Oxford Series MO, deep blue, shiny chrome finish, brown leather interior. Illinois license plate number JXC847. He washed the car every Sunday morning, personally, even though he had money to pay someone to do it. Rose joked that he loved that car more than her. Thomas would smile and respond that the car never argued with him. But not. Everything was domestic and tranquil. Thomas operated in a dangerous world. The Chicago police knew him well. Detective Harry Kovach, from the Homicide Division, had a file on Thomas with more than 50 pages. Minor offenses, suspicious associations, witnesses who changed their stories. But nothing stuck. Thomas was too careful, too smart. And there were rivals. Chicago's underworld was divided into invisible, but very real territories. The Italians controlled the West Side under the outfit. The Irish dominated parts of the South Side. And there were independents like Thomas, navigating between all, maintaining pragmatic relationships, avoiding direct conflicts. But tensions were growing. Business was changing. Heroin was beginning to enter heavily through the docks, something Thomas publicly despised. He had lines he would not cross. Nothing involving children. Nothing involving heavy narcotics. These were his rules. And in a world without law, personal rules made you either a target or made you respected. Thomas was both. Rose noticed the growing tension. Thomas slept less well, looked out the window more frequently, checked the street before leaving, changed the door lock twice in 3 months. When she asked, he would kiss her forehead and say everything was under control. But Rose knew that man better than anyone. She knew when he was worried. And in July of 1951, Thomas was very worried. Friday, the 13th of July, 1951. Yes, Friday, the 13th. The detail did not go unnoticed afterward. Chicago woke under suffocating heat, temperature already at 28 degrees Celsius at 9 in the morning, humidity coming from Lake Michigan making the air seem as thick as soup. The newspapers that morning carried headlines about the tensions of the Korean War and debates about the expansion of Midway Airport. Thomas woke at his normal time, 7 in the morning. Rose remembers that he was quiet that morning, more thoughtful than usual. He drank his coffee but barely touched the eggs and toast. He wore his gray suit, the 3-piece one with thin stripes that he reserved for important days. Navy blue tie. White handkerchief in the pocket. Gold watch on his wrist. A wedding present from Rose. Before leaving, Thomas did something unusual. He hugged Rose longer than normal. He held her face between his hands and looked into her eyes. "I love you, Rosie," he said. Rose laughed, surprised. Thomas was not a man for exaggerated emotional displays, not during the week. "I love you too, silly," she responded. "Will you be late?" "Maybe," Thomas said. "I have some business to resolve in Indiana, but I'll call at the normal time." 6:30. Always 6:30. At 8:15 in the morning, Thomas entered Rosie's corner. Rosie Kowalski, the owner, confirmed afterward that Thomas seemed normal, perhaps a bit more serious. He ordered his usual black coffee, read the Tribune for 40 minutes. Did not speak to anyone. At 9 o'clock, he left 50 cents as a tip, more than normal, and left. The blue Morris Oxford was parked on the street, impeccable as always. Witnesses saw Thomas get into the car and drive south, along Halsted Street. This was at 9:10 in the morning. At 10:30, Thomas was seen at Mickey's Diner near the Union Stockyards. He met with two men. No one could say afterward exactly who they were. Descriptions varied. Men in dark suits, one older with graying hair, one younger, with an angular face. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes. Witnesses said the conversation seemed tense, but there was no shouting, no visible confrontation. At 11 o'clock, Thomas left alone. He got into the Morris Oxford and drove south, along Ashland Avenue. A witness, a newspaper seller named Eddie Sullivan, remembers seeing the distinctive blue car pass along Pershing Road at 11:20. He was certain because he had just sold the midday edition. After that, things became nebulous. There is a possible identification of Thomas having lunch at a roadside diner in Hammond, Indiana, around noon, but the witness was not absolutely certain. The waitress remembered a man in a gray suit, but could not confirm it was Thomas. And then, for approximately 3 hours, Thomas Edward Callahan disappeared. There are no confirmed records, no reliable witnesses, just a hole in time where something happened, something that would change everything. What we know for certain is that at 6:30 in the evening, Rose's phone did not ring. 6:35, 6:40, 6:50. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Rose was nervous. At 7:30, she was worried. At 8, she was terrified. Thomas had never, in 3 years of marriage, failed to make that call. Not once. Rose called her brother, Vincent Moretti, who worked with Thomas. Vincent immediately started making calls. To bars, to contacts, to anyone who might have seen Thomas. No one knew anything. Vincent and 3 other men got into Vincent's Packard and started searching, driving through the streets of the South Side, checking all the usual places. Nothing. At 11 o'clock at night, Vincent convinced Rose to call the police. She resisted, knowing that police attention was the last thing Thomas would want. But fear overcame caution. The call was answered by the Bridgeport precinct. The sergeant on duty, James O'Brien, took down the details. Adult male, 34 years old, missing for a few hours. O'Brien was polite but direct. "Ma'am, adults disappear for many reasons. Usually they come back. He might be sleeping somewhere, might have met with friends. We'll take note, but honestly, it's too early to—" "You don't understand," Rose interrupted, voice trembling. "My husband doesn't do this. He always calls. Something happened. Something bad happened." O'Brien promised they would keep alert. But that night, no significant action was taken. It was just another man who did not come home at the expected time. But Rose knew. Deep in her heart, in that place where we love someone so deeply that we feel when something is wrong, she knew. Thomas was not late. Thomas was not in some bar. Thomas was in danger. Or worse. The last person to see Thomas Edward Callahan with certainty was that newspaper seller, Eddie Sullivan, watching the blue Morris Oxford pass along Pershing Road at 11:20 in the morning on the 13th of July, 1951. After that, Thomas simply ceased to exist, as if the world had swallowed him whole, as if he had crossed an invisible door and entered another world, as if someone had decided that Thomas Edward Callahan no longer deserved to occupy space in this reality. And for 73 years, no one knew what happened in those lost hours. No one knew where Thomas went. And no one, absolutely no one, knew where that blue Morris Oxford was. Until now. Saturday, the 14th of July, 1951. Rose did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, she was back at the precinct, this time accompanied by Vincent and 3 more men, all with expressions that made the police officers adjust their holsters. This time, they got attention. Detective Harry Kovach attended to them. He knew the name Thomas Callahan, knew the reputation. And when Rose described the Morris Oxford, including the license plate, Kovach made some calls. And that is when everything became stranger. No Indiana police officer had reported the car. There was no record of a blue Morris Oxford license plate JXC 847 in impound lots or police records. It was as if the car had simply evaporated along with Thomas. Kovach immediately expanded the investigation. The police began interviewing everyone who had seen Thomas that last day. Rosie Kowalski confirmed the breakfast. Witnesses confirmed the meeting at Mickey's Diner. The newspaper seller confirmed the car on Pershing Road. But there was a huge hole in the middle. Between 11:30 in the morning and 6:30 in the evening, approximately 7 hours, no one knew where Thomas was for certain. And in that interval, something happened. Something that changed everything. Kovach focused on the meeting at Mickey's Diner. Who were those 2 men? The diner owner, a Greek lady named Maria Stavros, said she had never seen those men before. They were not regulars. They paid in cash. They left right after Thomas. The police also investigated why Thomas would be in Indiana. Hammond was border territory, a place where obscure business happened away from Chicago's eyes. Kovach had a theory. Thomas was lured to a meeting in Indiana under false pretenses. Something went wrong. There was confrontation. Thomas was injured, perhaps killed. His body was hidden, and the car disappeared completely. But without a body, without a car, without witnesses, without more evidence, Kovach could not prove anything. Meanwhile, Vincent Moretti conducted his own parallel investigation. He and a dozen men spent weeks on the streets, asking questions that the police could not ask, using methods the police could not use. They pressured informants, confronted rivals, offered money, then threats. They found rumors. One guy said Thomas owed money to someone connected to the outfit. Another said Thomas had witnessed a murder and refused to stay quiet. A third suggested Thomas was planning to testify against powerful figures and was silenced. But everything was speculation. No concrete facts, no proof. 2 weeks passed. The police investigation began to cool. Kovach did not give up completely, but had other cases, other pressures. Thomas Callahan's file was marked as suspicious disappearance, possible homicide, but without a body, without conclusive evidence, there was nowhere to go. The press covered the case initially. Southside operator vanishes mysteriously, said the headline in the Chicago Daily News. But without developments, the story died in days. Chicago had crimes every day. Life went on. For Rose, life stopped. She continued living in the apartment above the bakery, continued working as a secretary, but it was a mechanical existence. Every night at 6:30, she looked at the phone, hoping it would ring. It never rang. She refused to declare Thomas dead. Years later, people suggested she move on, that she declare presumed death, that she take any insurance. Rose refused. As long as there is no body, there is hope, she would say. But her eyes told a different story. Her eyes said she already knew the truth, even if she did not want to accept it. Vincent eventually concluded what most already suspected. Thomas was killed. probably in those lost hours of the 13th of July. His body was somewhere, perhaps at the bottom of one of Indiana's many lakes, perhaps buried on a remote farm, perhaps dissolved in acid in some industrial basement. The car was destroyed or hidden so well it would never be found. But who? And why? Those questions remained unanswered. The years passed like a wound that never completely heals, only forms a fragile scab over the pain. 1952 turned into 1953. 1953 turned into 1960. 1960 turned into 1970. Rose's life became a permanent vigil, waiting for answers that never came. She never remarried, never had the children she and Thomas planned. She worked, saved, lived modestly in a small apartment in Pilsen, and every Friday, the 13th of July, no matter what decade, Rose lit a candle in the window. Chicago changed dramatically. The outfit continued dominating for decades, until federal investigations in the 80s began to dismantle it. The South Side transformed, neighborhoods changed character, old communities dispersed. The world Thomas knew, that code of honor among criminals, that structure of loyalties and territories, crumbled. Vincent Moretti never completely stopped searching. Even when he aged, even when his own children grew up and called him obsessed, Vincent kept his ears open. Every new criminal arrested, Vincent tried to ask, "Do you know anything about Thomas Callahan? 1951? Blue Morris, Oxford?" Nothing. Always nothing. New theories emerged over the years. In the 60s, someone suggested Thomas had been killed by communist agents, that he had gotten involved in espionage during the Korean War. There was no evidence for this, but it was the era of Cold War paranoia. In the 70s, an investigative journalist named Pete Russo developed a theory that Thomas had faked his own death, that he was alive somewhere, perhaps in Mexico or South America, living under a false name. Russo even published an article in the Chicago Reader. Rose read the article and wrote an angry letter to the editor. "My husband was not a coward. He would not leave me like that. This is cruel fantasy." In the 80s, Detective Harry Kovach, retired and dying of lung cancer, gave an interview to local TV before his death in 1986. He mentioned something that had never been made public, that in the week before disappearing, Thomas had appeared at the precinct, saying he wanted to talk about something important related to big people, but then got nervous and left without saying more. Kovach always wondered what Thomas wanted to reveal. That revelation briefly reignited interest. Was Thomas trying to become an informant? Did he know something about someone powerful in the outfit? Was he trying to make a deal? And did someone find out? But without Thomas, without documents, without corroboration, it was impossible to know. In 1997, Rose Callahan died at 72 years old, from complications of diabetes. Until her last days, she kept a photo of Thomas beside her bed. A wedding photo, both smiling in front of Holy Cross Church in back of the yards, young, alive, full of future. Vincent was at her side when she died. Rose's last words were, "I always knew you did not leave me by choice, Tommy. I always knew." Vincent died in 2005, at 83 years old. He left a box of documents for his grandson, Anthony Moretti, with a note. "Everything about Thomas. Maybe your generation will discover what happened." Anthony, a 35-year-old history professor, was fascinated by the story of the great-uncle he never knew. He digitized documents, created timelines, even started a podcast in 2010 dedicated to unsolved crimes in Chicago, with a special episode about Thomas. Some enthusiasts became interested, but nothing concrete emerged. With each decade, the story of Thomas Callahan became more obscure, more legend than reality. For most people, he was just another statistic, another name in dusty police files, another unsolved mystery among thousands. The modern world arrived. Technology transformed everything. DNA, advanced forensic analysis, digital databases, resources that would have solved the case in days if they had been available in 1951. But without a body, without preserved physical evidence, even modern technology is useless. And the blue Morris Oxford? Most people assumed it had been destroyed decades ago, crushed in some junkyard, recycled, transformed into other objects. Cars do not last forever, especially 1949 cars. But here is the thing about assumptions. Sometimes we are completely wrong. Sometimes the answers are there all along, just hidden where no one thought to look. Sometimes nature guards secrets better than any human vault. And sometimes 73 years is exactly the time a story needs to finally be told. April 2024. Spring in Jasper, Pulaski. Fish and Wildlife Area. A vast natural reserve in northwest Indiana. More than 8,000 acres of forests, swamps, and prairies that survived decades of industrial development around them. It is a place where residents of Chicago and Indianapolis go to forget they are near urban areas. A place where silence still exists. A group of birdwatchers, led by a local guide named Marcus Webb, decided to explore a less visited section of the reserve, near the border with Stark County. Marcus, 59 years old, had known those trails for decades, but this group wanted to see remote areas where sandhill cranes occasionally appeared out of season. They left the main trail around 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Marcus led them through a dense section of oak forest, where vegetation had grown so thick they could barely see the sky. The ground was soft with decades of decomposed leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. A woman in the group, Sarah Chen, a 30-year-old wildlife photographer, was taking pictures of a woodpecker when something caught her attention. A strange shape among the trees, covered with vegetation, but with angles that nature does not create. Straight lines underneath the moss. "Marcus," she called. "What is that?" Marcus looked, frowned, approached, and stopped, completely still. He had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather, who had worked as a forest ranger in that same reserve in the 60s. Stories about things found in the remote parts over the years. But this? "Stay there," Marcus instructed the group. He walked carefully closer, using a stick to push away vegetation. And then he saw clearly. A car. Completely swallowed by the forest, but undoubtedly a car. The shape was unmistakable despite the extreme deterioration. Moss covered every surface. Small trees grew through what had been the engine compartment. The windows had disappeared long ago, only rusted frames remained. The doors were torn off or lying beside it. The roof was partially collapsed. Nature had reclaimed that human object back, transforming metal into part of the organic landscape. Marcus took out his cell phone and took pictures. Then called the reserve administration. "You're going to want to see this," he said. On Monday, a team from the Department of Natural Resources arrived at the site, accompanied by Indiana State Police. What they found was extraordinary, not just because of the condition of the vehicle, but because of what it represented. With extreme care, they began to document and clear the vegetation around it. And when they managed to access the area where the license plate should be, after removing decades of rust, corrosion, and dirt, numbers were still vaguely visible. JXC 847, Illinois. One of the investigators checked the number in historical DMV databases, and it appeared accompanied by an old note. Associated with unsolved disappearance, July 1951, Chicago PD. Thomas Edward Callahan. The discovery was initially reported as local curiosity. Vintage 40s car discovered in natural reserve. But when investigative journalists dug deeper and connected it to the 73-year-old story, the story exploded in the Chicago region. Anthony Moretti, Vincent's grandson, learned of the news through a Google alert he had set up years before with the name Thomas Callahan. He did not believe it initially, checked multiple sources, and then, hands shaking, called his mother, who was Rose's niece. "They found the car," he said, voice breaking. "After all these years, they found Thomas's car." The Indiana State Police, in coordination with the Chicago Police Department, officially reopened the case. A specialized cold case investigation team was assigned. They established a perimeter around the area, complete forensic photography, precise measurements, vegetation analysis to determine how long the car had been there. And they discovered something extraordinary. The car had been in that forest since approximately the early 50s. Examination of the trees growing through it confirmed they were about 70 years old. The oxidation and deterioration were consistent with more than 7 decades of exposure, but the most revealing analysis of the soil and position of the vehicle suggested it had not simply been abandoned. Evidence indicated the car had been deliberately hidden, driven into the dense forest, at a time when that area was even more remote and inaccessible, and intentionally camouflaged. This changed everything. The car was not casually abandoned on some road. Someone had driven this vehicle into a remote natural reserve, miles into dense forest, and hidden it. This required knowledge of the area, planning, time. This was not spontaneous. It was very deliberate. But the question everyone wanted answered: was there anything inside? Forensic specialists spent days carefully sifting through the vegetation, earth, decomposed leaves, and debris that filled what had been the car's interior. Every fragment was photographed, catalogued, preserved. And they found things. Not a complete body, not immediately. But objects. A silver lighter, heavily, corroded but still with partially legible engraving when cleaned in the laboratory. TEC, fabric fragments that analysis determined were consistent with men's wool suit from that era. Pieces of leather from the seat, surprisingly preserved by the acidic chemistry of the soil. Shirt buttons, a metal comb, and something that made everyone stop: a bullet. A single .38 special caliber bullet, lodged in what would have been the back of the driver's seat, deformed by impact. The bullet was sent for ballistics analysis. It was from an era before modern records and detailed marking, but specialists confirmed it was the type commonly used in revolvers in the 40s and 50s, typically Smith & Wesson or Colt. One shot. In the driver's seat. What did this mean? Had someone shot Thomas while he was in the car? The implication was clear and sinister. But there were still no human remains. This could mean Thomas was never in the car when it was taken to the forest. Or it could mean his body was removed. 73 years is enough time for organic remains to disappear completely in a forest environment. But there was a third possibility, one that investigators seriously considered. Perhaps Thomas's body was there, just not in the car. Perhaps it was buried nearby. The reserve is vast, and in 1951, that specific area was even more remote and inaccessible. Certified cadaver dogs were brought in from the FBI's K-9 unit. For 3 weeks, they worked the area, around the car in concentric search patterns, gradually expanding the radius. And finally, on the 28th of May, 2024, 38 meters northeast of where the car was found, in a natural depression partially covered by old tree roots, the dogs persistently alerted. Careful archaeological excavation began. And on the 2nd of June, 2024, 72 years and 11 months after the disappearance of Thomas Edward Callahan, human remains were discovered, buried approximately 1.5 meters deep, in soil that stratigraphic analysis showed had been disturbed decades ago, significantly before the growth of the roots that now covered the area. The remains were in condition consistent with more than 7 decades of burial. Complete skeletonization, but still identifiable as human, adult, male, based on pelvic and cranial structure. DNA analysis was immediately requested. Anthony Moretti was contacted. Fortunately, Thomas's sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, had children, and some descendants still lived. DNA from two great-nieces of Thomas was collected for comparison. Mitochondrial DNA could establish kinship through Thomas's maternal line. The weeks of waiting were agony for the Callahan-Moretti family. Chicago media covered every development. Thomas Callahan's case, forgotten for generations, suddenly became a local sensation, then national. True crime podcasts produced special episodes. Documentary producers contacted the family. In July 2024, the results arrived from the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed kinship consistent with the maternal lineage of the Callahan family. Additionally, isotopic analysis of the teeth confirmed the individual grew up in the Great Lakes region, consistent with Chicago. With reasonable scientific certainty, those were the remains of Thomas Edward Callahan. He had been there all along. For 73 years, while Rose waited, while Vincent searched, while theories circulated, Thomas was there, buried in an Indiana forest, only about 60 kilometers from where he disappeared, keeping his secrets under earth and roots. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed details that finally began to assemble the final puzzle of Thomas Edward Callahan. The skeleton showed multiple perimortem fractures, those that occur at the time of death or shortly before. The skull had a significant depressed fracture in the posterior occipital region, indicating severe blow with a heavy, blunt object. 3 ribs on the left side had been broken, fractures consistent with intense physical trauma. And most revealing, there was clear evidence of gunshot trauma. An entry hole in the second thoracic vertebra, with projectile fragments still preserved in the spinal canal. In simple terms, Thomas was brutally beaten and shot in the back. The bullet hit his spine, which meant the shot was probably fatal or incapacitating. The exact sequence of traumas is impossible to determine with absolute certainty, but the pattern suggested extreme and sustained violence. The bullet found in the car now made perfect sense. Someone shot Thomas inside the Morris Oxford, probably when he was in the driver's seat. The projectile went through his body, lodged in the seat back. Whether it was instantly fatal or not, Thomas was gravely injured and incapacitated. And then he was finished off, probably with the blows that caused the other fractures. Investigators revisited all the historical files from 1951 with new perspective. The lost hours of the 13th of July, the tense meeting at Mickey's Diner, Thomas's mention of business in Indiana. A coherent theory emerged, built from physical evidence and historical context. Thomas was lured to that meeting at Mickey's Diner under some pretext, possibly legitimate business. The 2 unidentified men were the decoy. After the meeting, Thomas drove to Indiana, possibly believing he would meet someone for a deal. At some point during the trip, he was ambushed. Perhaps one of the men was hidden in the back seat of the Morris Oxford. Perhaps they followed him in another vehicle and forced him to stop at an isolated location. Thomas was shot, probably while driving or sitting in the car. Wounded but perhaps still alive, he was subdued. The attackers then drove 2 vehicles, the Morris Oxford and their own car, into Jasper, Pulaski, an area that in 1951 was even more wild and less monitored. There, hidden among trees, far from any possibility of interruption, whatever had begun was concluded. Thomas was killed through additional trauma to the skull. His body was buried in a carefully chosen location. The car was hidden deep in the forest, destined never to be found, and the killers left in the second vehicle, leaving no trail. It was a planned execution, not a crime of opportunity or passion. It was deliberate silencing. But the question that remains, that frustrates investigators and family equally. Who? Historical files listed dozens of possible enemies. Outfit operators Thomas would have crossed. independent dealers competing for territory. There is even mention in old files that Thomas had refused to participate in the heroin trafficking that was beginning to dominate Chicago's underworld, which would have made him a target of more violent factions. And there is that mention from Detective Kovacs about Thomas trying to reveal something about big people. Did he know too much about someone powerful? Was he trying to cooperate with authorities and was discovered? Detective Commander Lisa Rodriguez, who led the reopened investigation in 2024, was frank in a press conference held in August. Based on forensic evidence, we are certain that Thomas Callahan was a victim of premeditated homicide. We believe at least 2 people, possibly 3, were involved. The crime was planned carefully and executed deliberately. But here is the difficult reality we face. All the probable suspects identified in 1951 investigations are now deceased. We have no living witnesses willing or able to speak. We have no confessions. Physical evidence tells us what happened and approximately how, but cannot tell us who specifically. This case remains technically open, but realistically, identification and prosecution of specific perpetrators is extremely unlikely at this point. That statement generated frustration in some, but also realistic understanding. Justice has temporal limitations, and 73 years is too long for traditional criminal accountability. But there are intriguing clues that emerged. In the days after the discovery gained national attention, an elderly 91-year-old man named Frank Kozlowski, living in a care facility in Cicero, saw the news coverage and asked to speak with investigators. Kozlowski had been a low-level worker at the docks and warehouses of the South Side in the 50s, with peripheral connections to organized crime. He told a story he had kept for decades, afraid of retaliation that now, in extreme old age, no longer mattered. In August 1951, a few weeks after Thomas disappeared, Frank was in a warehouse doing a nighttime loading job. 2 men he did not know personally, but recognized as connected to the outfit, were talking quietly, thinking they were alone. Frank heard a fragment of conversation that stayed etched in his memory. Something about Callahan and Indiana Forest and won't find. At the time, Frank did not fully understand, or preferred not to understand. Asking questions was dangerous. But now, 7 decades later, those words gained dark meaning. Frank could not identify the men with certainty. Faces had faded with time, but he remembered that one of them had a distinctly Polish accent and a visible scar on his neck. Investigators checked historical records. There was an outfit enforcer in the 50s, named Victor "Vic the Pole" Kowalski, known for having a burn scar on his neck. Victor died in 1973 in a federal prison, serving a sentence for extortion. But he was never connected to Thomas's disappearance. That information, though fascinating, leads nowhere legally. Victor has been dead for 50 years. There is no way to confirm or refute, but at least it offers a possible direction. Thomas was silenced by order or action of the outfit, probably because he refused to participate in activities that violated his personal code, or because he knew something dangerous. Another clue emerged from analysis of the burial site. The choice of location showed specific knowledge of the Jasper-Pulaski area. It was not simply entering any forest. That specific area in 1951 was accessible only by little-used dirt roads, but still reachable with appropriate vehicle for someone who knew the way. Someone with experience in rural Indiana areas. Perhaps someone who hunted there or who grew up in the region. Investigators identified that there had been a small illegal moonshine operation that operated in nearby areas during the Prohibition era and following years, using the remoteness of the reserve. Some individuals involved in that smuggling later had connections to organized crime in Chicago. It is possible that whoever killed Thomas had that historical knowledge. But again, clues that lead to places that can no longer be explored. Generations died. Memories are gone. And there is the element that cannot be ignored, the symbolic aspect of hiding Thomas in a forest. It was a practical choice, certainly, but it was also a statement. Burying someone in a wild place where nature consumes civilization is a form of erasure. It is saying, you do not deserve even a marked grave nor preserved memory. It is the most complete silencing possible. Anthony Moretti, now 49 years old and family spokesperson, shared reflections in an interview. For 73 years, we lived with absence, not resolution. My grandmother Rose died without knowing, and that breaks my heart. But she always knew intuitively that Thomas did not leave her by choice. She was right. Now we know that Thomas suffered terribly, that he was betrayed and brutally murdered. It is painful, even devastating. But it is also truth. And truth, however painful it may be, is better than eternal uncertainty that consumes families through generations. Thomas Edward Callahan was buried again, this time with full ceremony, in September 2024. His headstone stands in Mount Carmel Catholic Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, not far from where many of his generation rest. The inscription says, Thomas Edward Callahan, 1917-1951. Beloved husband of Rose lost for 7 decades, now at peace. I always knew, Tommy, Rose. More than 300 people attended the funeral. Extended family, descendants of people who knew Thomas, criminal history enthusiasts who followed the case, representatives from Chicago and Indiana police, and surprisingly, a 93-year-old man named James O'Brien, Jr., son of the sergeant who received Rose's call that first night, who came to pay respects representing his deceased father, who always regretted not taking that call more seriously. The blue Morris Oxford, or what remained of it, was preserved. The Chicago History Museum requested permission to display it as part of an exhibition about unsolved crimes of the 20th century and Chicago's underworld in the 50s. The family agreed, with one condition, that Thomas's complete story be told, not just his death, but his life, his love for Rose, his principles, his humanity. Because, in the end, that is the profound lesson that cases like this offer. Thomas Edward Callahan was not just gangster who disappeared. He was a son who supported a widowed mother, brother who protected his sisters, husband who put fresh flowers on the table every Friday, man with moral code even operating outside the law, human being who deserved more than to be buried nameless in a forest. But questions still remain. Questions always remain in cases like this. Who exactly pulled the trigger? Who dug the grave? Who drove the car into that forest? Those specific identities probably died with the perpetrators, all now decades buried themselves. And there is a larger, more philosophical question. If Thomas's car and body remained hidden for 73 years, how many other stories are out there, waiting? How many other unsolved disappearances have answers buried in remote places, silenced by time and nature? Statistics indicate there are tens of thousands of unsolved missing persons cases in the United States, some for decades. Each one is an untold story. Each one is someone who was loved. Each one is a mystery that consumes entire families through generations, exactly as happened with Rose, Vincent, and everyone who loved Thomas. The story of Thomas Callahan is remarkable not because it was completely solved, but because resolution happened. Most never have that closure. Most remain in the category of missing, a word that carries infinite weight of possibilities without offering any certainty. And then there is the aspect of pure time. 73 years, almost 3/4 of a century. Time enough for the world to change unrecognizably. In 1951, the Korean War was beginning. Television was a novelty. Computers occupied entire rooms. DNA was just a molecule that scientists were beginning to map. And now, In 2024, we carry supercomputers in our pockets. DNA can be sequenced in hours, and we can communicate instantly with anywhere on the planet. But one thing remains unchanged through all these decades: the human capacity for violence, betrayal, and cruelty. And the equally human capacity, perhaps more powerful, for love, persistent memory, and absolute refusal to forget. Rose never forgot, never gave up waiting. Vincent never stopped searching, never accepted not knowing. Anthony kept the memory alive through generations who never knew Thomas. It is because of them that when the Morris Oxford was finally discovered, someone still knew what that license plate number meant. It is because of them that Thomas has a name on his headstone now, has his story told, has justice, even if incomplete. There is a final detail, small but significant. When forensic specialists carefully cleaned the lighter found in the car, the one with the initials TEC, and used advanced restoration techniques, they managed to identify that there was something more engraved on the inner surface. The letters were almost invisible after decades of corrosion, but modern imaging technology managed to reveal, "To Tommy, R." Rose gave that lighter to Thomas as a birthday present in May 1951, just 2 months before he disappeared. And he carried it with him until the end. Through that last morning, through the tense meeting, through whatever happened in those lost hours, through the final horror, that small silver object connecting two hearts through violence, time, and mystery that no human cruelty could completely destroy. And perhaps that is what stories like this really teach us at the deepest level. Not about crime itself, but about human connections that crime tries to destroy and fails. Because love proves more enduring than hate, memory proves stronger than forgetting, and truth eventually always finds a way through any darkness, no matter how long it takes, no matter how many decades must pass. Thomas Edward Callahan disappeared on Friday, the 13th of July, 1951. For 73 years, he was just a name in dusty files, a story whispered in South Side bars, an open wound in a family. But in 2024, a blue Morris Oxford, swallowed by the forest but not destroyed, brought Thomas back. Not alive, but also no longer lost. No longer a mystery without resolution, but tragedy with testimony, with truth, with imperfect but real closure. And as we walk through life, through our own cities and forests, it is worth remembering that stories are everywhere, buried, waiting. Stories of people who were, people who loved, people who suffered injustices that time tried to erase. Some of these secrets eventually emerge, as Thomas emerged from that Indiana forest. Others remain buried, forever, silenced by the weight of decades. But each one matters. Every lost story represents a life lived, love shared, injustice uncorrected. Each one deserves to be remembered, sought, honored. And that, in the end, is the most powerful promise we can make to each other. That we will not forget. That we will continue searching for answers even when they seem impossible. That we will continue asking questions even when decades have passed. That stories like that of Thomas Edward Callahan will never be completely silenced, not while there are people willing to listen, investigate, witness, and remember. The Morris Oxford is in a museum now, an oxidized witness to a century of change, but still speaking truths that no one could completely silence. Thomas is finally at peace, his name restored, his story told. And somewhere, perhaps in another forest, perhaps in another hidden and forgotten place, other stories await their discovery. Other disappearances await to be resolved. Because mystery can last decades, can last almost an entire century. But truth, eventually, always finds light.